This is not a conspiracy theory or conjecture. Rather, it is the result of decades of careful research conducted by some of the most distinguished scholars in ancient languages and biblical studies. Are you certain that your beliefs derived from the Bible reflect the truth? For more than 2 millennia, countless individuals have entrusted their faith to these sacred texts, viewing them as a direct communication from the divine. A single mistranslated word has the power to profoundly change the meaning of a phrase. A single misinterpreted sentence has the power to reshape an entire doctrine, and a distorted teaching can reshape the beliefs of countless individuals. In this presentation, we shall unveil 3 of the most unsettling truths regarding translations of the Bible. It is indeed astonishing to consider how political decisions from the Middle Ages may have profoundly influenced our perception of the divine. Did you know that the concept of hell, which has troubled humanity for 2,000 years, might actually stem from a mistranslation? Moreover, it is possible that a fundamental tenet of Christianity arose from a misunderstanding of ancient Hebrew texts. At times, to fortify our faith, we must summon the courage to confront the most challenging question of all. Do we truly grasp God's message, or are we simply accepting what others wish for us to accept? If you are prepared to delve into insights that may profoundly transform your understanding of the Scriptures, then embrace the journey ahead. The truth, regardless of its discomfort, is always valuable to uncover. The impact of Bible translations on faith. Over 2 millennia, the holy adventure of biblical translation substantially shapes the spiritual basis of innumerable believers across ages. Although the Bible's message has attracted billions of devoted readers across history, modern academic study reveals a rich tapestry of interpretation difficulties that have shaped our knowledge of these ancient books. Though done with enormous dedication, the translating process has always resulted in little but important changes in meaning that nevertheless influence religious doctrine and practice now. Biblical translations have a significant impact going much beyond simple language conversion. Every translation carries the cultural traces of its time, the theological interpretations of its translators, and the social mores of its day. Though some original subtleties may have been changed or lost in this transmission process, these translations have acted as links between ancient wisdom and modern knowledge. Whether intentional or unconscious, translators' interpretation choices have affected how whole generations comprehend and live their faith. According to historical data, many variations in biblical interpretation resulted from the natural difficulty of translating ancient languages into modern tongues, rather than from intentional manipulations. Every generation of translators had to preserve divine truth and make it available to their successors on a massive scale. Different interpretive choices resulting from this careful balancing between preservation and accessibility have permeated religious understanding. Maintaining authenticity while guaranteeing comprehensibility has proved difficult, and several translations represent diverse ways to handle this basic conflict. Biblical translations have progressed alongside humanity's enduring quest for understanding and a deeper relationship with divine wisdom. From the earliest manuscripts to today's digital versions, each translation reflects a genuine commitment to convey sacred knowledge across various languages and cultures. However, the theological assumptions, political pressures, and cultural contexts of numerous historical periods have inevitably influenced this journey. Throughout different eras and regions, these factors have molded the interpretation of sacred texts. Contemporary studies reveal that translations can sometimes inadvertently alter significant concepts from their original context, Over the course of centuries, these shifts have influenced fundamental aspects of faith and practice. For example, small changes in the words we use can have big effects on how we understand theology, which can change how Christians think about the nature of God, our responsibility, and spiritual restoration. Collectively, these translation choices have shaped religious beliefs and rituals in ways that may stray from their original intent. These translations profoundly influence the core of religious communities. Over millennia, they have established liturgical customs, impacted ethical principles, and laid the groundwork for religious instruction. Translators' words have evolved into the cornerstone for innumerable sermons, theological books, and personal devotions, so illustrating the broad effects of their decisions. These language choices have significant consequences for how faith groups view their interaction with the divine and their place in the world. According to modern biblical studies, translation choices have affected many widely accepted religious ideas as much as the original texts themselves have. This knowledge helps Christians interact more profoundly with their religious legacy, honoring both their heavenly inspiration and human transmission, and augmenting the spiritual relevance of these books. The realization of how translation shapes religious thought creates fresh paths for theological study and spiritual development. These revelations of the translating process have significant ramifications for modern faith. They provide chances for closer interaction with original meanings and urge Christians to think about how historical and cultural elements have shaped their perspective of sacred books. Realizing this can lead to a more complex and grown-up religion that understands both the power of divine truth and the difficulty of passing down texts. The awareness of translation's impact urges a more careful and involved attitude toward religious materials. Thus, the path of biblical translation marks an ongoing conversation between modern knowledge and ancient wisdom. Although flawless translations are unattainable, the efforts of every generation to comprehend and transmit these holy writings help define our shared spiritual legacy. This continuous process invites Christians to interact deliberately with their faith traditions while still being receptive to fresh understanding of old truths. More meaningful interaction with holy books results from the recognition of how translating shapes religious knowledge. To understand how Bible translations have affected faith, you have to recognize both how well these writings have been kept alive over thousands of years and how challenging it is to share difficult spiritual ideas across language and cultural barriers. This understanding offers a more deep respect of the diversity and richness of religious tradition, therefore enhancing rather than diminishing religion. Knowing the impact of translation can help one develop more real religious practice and enhance spiritual knowledge. Examining biblical translating history demonstrates the complex interaction of language, culture, and spiritual truth. Every translation choice, no matter how small, has shaped Christians' understanding and application of their beliefs. This awareness invites a more complex approach to religious texts, appreciating their human transmission over time, as well as their divine source. Translation decisions still influence religious knowledge and practice in ways that demand serious thought and deliberate attention. Examining biblical translations over time also emphasizes the amazing fortitude of religious faith over language and cultural barriers. Even with the complexity and possible misinterpretation brought forth by translation, the central ideas of faith have stayed relevant to believers across many years. This tenacity speaks to the potency of the original writings, as well as the commitment of many translators who have worked to preserve and distribute these hallowed lessons. Moreover, the influence of biblical translations extends beyond the confines of religious communities, impacting broader social and cultural development. The choices translated have shaped not only religious understanding, but also literary traditions, ethical principles, and cultural standards. This extensive influence highlights the profound consequences of translation decisions and their role in shaping human society. The complex nature of translation. The complex process of biblical translation offers difficult tasks covering linguistic, cultural, and spiritual aspects. Written in ancient Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, the original writings have layers of meaning modern translators find difficult to completely grasp. Many times, each word in these old languages has several implications, cultural references, and spiritual meanings that defy straightforward translocation into modern languages. Particularly, the Hebrew language has a special quality, whereby individual words have root meanings that divide into several interpretations. One Hebrew word might cover ideas that in modern languages call for whole phrases or paragraphs to effectively describe. Translators trying to maintain accuracy and readability find considerable difficulty in this language diversity. Aramaic parts of the Bible provide different difficulties. Aramaic books can have subtleties that would be lost in translation, as a language closely allied to Hebrew, yet with its own idioms and expressions. The cultural setting in which these works were produced adds still another level of intricacy, since many Aramaic expressions depend on knowledge of ancient Near Eastern traditions and social systems. The original Greek text of the New Testament raises several but equally difficult problems. The common language of the Mediterranean world in the 1st century CE, Koine Greek, has grammatical patterns and verbal tenses absent in many modern languages. While preserving the theological integrity of the text, translators have to make tough decisions in presenting these intricate language elements. Historical translations, like the King James Version and Jerome's Latin Vulgate, show how language and cultural settings affect translocation decisions. Computed to have been finished about 405 CE, the Vulgate became the accepted Latin Bible for almost a millennium. Its translators mirrored both the theological perspective of late Roman Christianity and the literary constraints of Latin. Likewise, commissioned in 1604, the King James Version captures early modern English use as well as the political religious milieu of Jacobean England. Different translation philosophies have resulted from the difficulty of keeping accuracy while guaranteeing readability. Some translators support formal equivalency, trying to keep the grammatical structures of the original language as nearly exact as feasible. Others advocate for dynamic equivalency, focusing on effectively communicating the original text's meaning and impact to modern readers. Every method has advantages and limits. Technical vocabulary might be especially challenging. Greek and ancient Hebrew names for religious ideas, cultural customs, or natural events usually lack precise modern parallels. Whether we transliterate this terminology, include explanatory comments, or search for approximate current equivalents, each decision has implications for understanding the text. The difficulty spans whole ideas and viewpoints, as well as specific words. Modern Western thinking is not at all like ancient, Near Eastern and Greco-Roman intellectual traditions. Ideas that the original audiences would have known clearly may need careful clarification for modern readers. Translators have to strike a balance between making these historic viewpoints available to contemporary audiences and preserving them. Poetic sections present unique challenges, frequently employing elements distinctive to the original languages, Biblical poetry weaves together parallelism, acrostics, and wordplay, literary devices that enrich the text. Translators face the critical choice of whether to prioritize the preservation of these literary forms or to focus on conveying the emotional and spiritual resonance of the poetry. Additionally, variations in manuscripts introduce another layer of complexity. Numerous ancient copies exist, with minor discrepancies, compelling translators to exercise informed judgment in selecting which readings to adopt. Such decisions can significantly influence the understanding and interpretation of particular passages. The social and cultural contexts of the original texts and their intended audiences significantly shape translation decisions. Translators must consider how different societies perceive and express concepts such as spiritual experiences, familial connections, and authority. These elements affect the interpretation or adaptation of cultural references, as well as the translation of specific terms. Contemporary translation efforts benefit from scholarly resources that were inaccessible to earlier generations, alongside technological advancements. Discoveries in archaeology, linguistic analysis tools, and digital databases provide new insights into ancient languages and cultures. However, these advancements also reveal greater complexities within the texts that translators must navigate. It's getting harder and harder to translate the Bible because of new issues like gender-inclusive language, cultural sensitivity, and the theological effects of translation. Each generation of translators faces the task of addressing these issues while remaining faithful to the original texts and meeting the expectations of contemporary readers. Knowing these nuances helps readers value the limits of current translations as well as their success. It promotes a more complex method of reading the Bible that takes into account the several elements affecting how old writings find their way to modern readers. Appreciating the continuous nature of translation activity, this understanding may lead to a closer interaction with the Scriptures. The multifaceted character of biblical translation reminds us that comprehending holy books calls for both intellectual rigor and spiritual sensitivity. Translation is not only translating words between languages, but also spanning enormous gaps of time, culture, and worldview to transmit eternal truths to the next generations. 3 major illustrations of mistranslations. Several important terms and ideas have changed significantly in meaning during millennia of biblical translation, greatly influencing religious doctrine and comprehension. Translation decisions have impacted religious practice and theological growth, as demonstrated by 3 noteworthy cases. Hell, Gehenna, is a concept. Originally referring to a real site outside Jerusalem's boundaries, Gehenna helps to define the current conception of hell. Historically, the Valley of Hinnom, Gehinnom in Hebrew, was a rubbish dump where fires burned constantly to devour waste and ward against sickness. In ancient Jewish philosophy, this location was not perpetual suffering, but rather a potent symbol for cleansing and eradicating evil. However, the translation of this specific metaphor into several languages and its spread throughout medieval European society transformed it into an abstract concept of perpetual guilt. Along with medieval artistic interpretations, Greek mythology, especially ideas like Hades and Tartarus, and their impact shaped the evolution of this translation. Working in their cultural settings, translators progressively changed the meaning from a physical symbol of destruction to a complex theology of constant suffering. They fundamentally changed Christian teaching, pastoral practice, and popular religious imagination for millennia. Theological consequences of this mistranslation go beyond basic semantics. Emphasizing destruction and purification instead of perpetual punishment, The original idea suggested a much different conception of divine justice and atonement. The modern study's rediscovery of the original context questions long-held beliefs regarding perpetual punishment and urges a review of conventional wisdom. Alma, the virgin birth. The Hebrew word Alma is at the core of another important transliteration problem, originally meaning young woman or maiden. Its translation into Greek as Parthenos, virgin, in the Septuagint, profoundly affected Christian theology. This translation decision proved fundamental for the virgin birth theory and thereby shaped Mariology, the religious study of Mary. The difficulty of this translation extends beyond basic word choice. In ancient Hebrew society, Alma was a synonym for young and marriageable age, without particularly suggesting virginity. Other Hebrew words more precisely denoted virginity. The choice of Parthenos in the Greek translation reflected both growing religious interpretations and language constraints. Particularly with regard to Mary's place in redemption history, this translation choice has had broad consequences for Christian belief. Though spiritually significant for millions of people, the formation of complex Marian theology mostly rests on one translation decision. Knowing the original Hebrew phrase forces one to consider closely how choices of translation affect theological growth. Image of the divine, B'Tselem Elohim. Another significant challenge in translation is the term B'Tselem Elohim, which describes humanity as created in the image of God. The original Hebrew conveys a profound declaration of human equality and dignity, but later translations showed more and more hierarchical power structures, especially when looked at through the lens of Greek philosophical ideas. The Hebrew concept of image, tselem, had specific ramifications for duty and portrayal. Ancient Near Eastern society revered kings as images of their gods, thereby expressing heavenly authority. The biblical use of this word for all mankind suggested all people share equal dignity and divine representation. Hence, it radicalized royal thought. But when expressed in Greek and then other languages, this idea progressively absorbed Platonic and hierarchical ideas of image and representation. Sometimes these intellectual codings hid the fundamental egalitarian drive of the book, resulting in interpretations that supported, rather than questioned, societal inequalities. These translators' decisions have effects beyond theological abstraction in political and social spheres. Translations of the revolutionary message of human equality reflected and strengthened current power systems, therefore, largely muffling them. Recovering the radical social consequences of the text depends on knowing its original setting. These three case studies show how political systems, philosophical frameworks, and cultural settings interact with translating decisions to define religious thinking. In modern research, finding the original meanings means taking a close look at how translation affects religious thought and practice. This doesn't mean rejecting later theological progress. These mistranslations continue to shape modern theological debate. Knowing their roots and development enables Christians to interact more deliberately with their religious traditions while still being receptive to fresh ideas from linguistic and historical studies. Acknowledging these translational problems encourages a closer reading of biblical texts instead of discounting conventional readings totally. It shows how the intricate interplay among language, culture, and spiritual perception shapes religious knowledge. This understanding presents chances for more complex theological contemplation and can enhance rather than weaken faith. These illustrations also show how constantly changing translation is. New insights on how ancient books talked to their initial audiences and how they might speak to modern believers surface as study develops and cultural settings change. This ongoing conversation between the past and the present enhances religious knowledge while also respecting conventional views. Examining these mistranslations reminds us that religious books and practices grow out of intricate historical processes. Knowing these mechanisms helps one to interact more sincerely with holy books, while appreciating their supernatural inspiration as well as human transmission across time. The connection between faith and governance. Political power and religious authority have greatly shaped biblical translations throughout history. Maintaining theological accuracy, translators and religious authorities frequently found themselves negotiating difficult political terrain. This dynamic has resulted in translators who occasionally gave institutional interests top priority over exact correctness. Early in Christian history, Bible translation developed a political component. As Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, translation choices further reflected imperial interests. To preserve social order and religious harmony, emperors and church officials recognized the need to regulate religious books. This political religious union determined the translation and understanding of key ideas. This political religious nexus grew more intense in medieval Europe. Maintaining its monopoly on biblical interpretation and keeping Latin translations out of reach for regular people, the Catholic Church had political as well as religious goals. While upholding current social and political systems, the Church's control over translation helped preserve its authority as the exclusive interpreter of divine truth. The development of common translations throughout the Reformation era shows how political authority molded biblical interpretation. Protestant reformers produced translations in local languages, therefore challenging the authority of the Catholic Church. But these translations frequently mirrored their respective political settings and theological goals. For example, Martin Luther's German Bible shaped German political and linguistic unity, as well as theological reform. The King James Version, completed in 1611, stands as a prominent example of the intersection between political influence and Bible translation. Commissioned by King James I of England, this translation aimed to foster religious unity within his realm, thereby bolstering his political authority. The translators had to follow strict rules that accounted for both political and religious factors. This meant that the language and words they used had to fit with the royal power and the current church structure. Also, the way potentially subversive passages were treated was affected by political dynamics, which led to translations that often strengthened power structures instead of challenging them. For instance, translators frequently crafted interpretations of texts addressing social justice and economic equality to uphold, rather than critique, the status quo. The expansion of colonies gave Bible translation fresh political relevance. Missionaries and colonial officials approached translation from their respective political and cultural perspectives. Their translations affected how indigenous people received and interpreted biblical messages by occasionally reflecting colonial perspective and power systems. Many times, these translations conveyed political and cultural presumptions that shaped local interpretation of Christian doctrine. The Cold War brought further political strains for Bible translation. Translations into communist nations sometimes had to negotiate difficult political constraints or suffer censorship. Translations in the West, however, occasionally mirrored anti-communist attitudes, therefore shaping the interpretation of several sections on social organization and power. Projects using modern translations still run into political difficulties. Choices about religious terminology, cultural adaptation, and gender-inclusive language sometimes include negotiating difficult political and societal norms. Translators must strike a mix between attention to modern political and social issues and loyalty to original writings. The impact of religious establishments adds still another level of difficulty. Diverse denominational backgrounds often lead to distinct translation decisions that reflect varying theological perspectives. Sometimes at the price of other readings, these decisions might support institutional power and theological distinctives. Historically, religious leaders have had significant influence over which translations are accepted in their particular countries. This control covers keeping theological consistency and institutional authority, in addition to simple accuracy issues. The acceptance or rejection of specific translations usually reflects theological and institutional agendas. There are continuous difficulties in the interaction between intellectual translation activity and religious authority. Religious institutions worried about preserving doctrinal stability may object to academic discoveries, challenging conventional wisdom. The conflict between academia and authority still shapes the way translations are done and received. Translation choices frequently hinge on financial considerations. Publishers, religious organizations, and academic institutions involved in translation must carefully assess institutional priorities alongside market demands. These practical matters can significantly influence decisions regarding marketing strategies, target audiences, and translation styles. The emergence of the Internet era has significantly transformed the political and religious landscape surrounding biblical translation. With online access to a multitude of translations and original language resources, the interpretation of Scripture has become more accessible to a wider audience. However, institutional and political influences still play a crucial role in the development, promotion, and acceptance of these translations. Understanding these factors allows readers to engage with translations in a more thoughtful and critical way. It serves as a reminder that each translation embodies not just linguistic choices, but also intricate social, political, and religious dynamics. This awareness enriches one's interaction with biblical texts, fostering a deeper appreciation for the various influences that shape their interpretation and translation. The ongoing influence of politics and religion in Bible translation highlights the necessity for transparency in translation methods and decisions. Contemporary translation efforts increasingly recognize the importance of understanding these impacts while striving for both accessibility and precision. A call to re-examine original meanings. Revisiting the original meanings of biblical texts is not only essential in today's world, but also profoundly engaging. This academic endeavor encompasses historical contextualization, linguistic analysis, and meticulous examination of ancient manuscripts. Advances in technology and research methodologies now provide unprecedented access to the original contexts and interpretations of these sacred writings. New insights into the ancient world that produced these texts arise from continuous archaeological discoveries. Each new find sheds light on the language, social dynamics, and cultural context in which biblical authors wrote. Often, these revelations challenge established beliefs and offer fresh perspectives on familiar works. For instance, the Dead Sea Scrolls have significantly altered our understanding of early Christian environments and Second Temple Judaism. The study of linguistics has significantly enhanced our understanding of ancient Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Today, scholars can delve into these languages with greater precision, uncovering nuances and meanings that earlier translators may have missed. Through computer-aided analysis of ancient texts, we can reveal literary structures and word frequencies that provide new insights into the meaning of the texts. The evolution of digital instruments has changed biblical study. Modern tools allow advanced software to simultaneously compare thousands of manuscript variants, therefore guiding researchers toward the most likely original readings. These instruments also allow thorough study of word usage patterns in ancient literature, therefore offering more background for knowledge of biblical vocabulary and ideas. Historical study continues to illuminate the social, political, and theological settings of biblical texts. Knowing these settings helps one rediscover original meanings, possibly lost by later interpretative traditions. Often stressing important variations from modern readings, this study shows how ancient audiences might have comprehended these works. Important new perspectives on the worldviews that formed biblical writings come from anthropological research in ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean societies. Knowing how ancient people saw relationships, authority, spirituality, and community helps contemporary readers to better understand the original ramifications of biblical teachings. Often, this cultural setting reveals meanings very different from conventional wisdom. Furthermore, the study of old literary forms and norms has advanced dramatically. Scholars today better know how various Bible genres fit their original settings. This knowledge helps readers identify rhetorical methods, separate literal from metaphorical language, and value the deft literary devices used by biblical writers. Comparative religious studies offer more background for appreciating biblical works. Understanding ancient Near Eastern religions, Second Temple Judaism, and early Christian diversity helps academics grasp how biblical writers interacted with their modern religious surroundings. Often, this comparative method highlights subtleties overlooked in conventional wisdom. Recovering original meanings calls for significant attention to translation problems. Modern academics are seeing more and more how theological presumptions have affected classic translations. Critical analysis of these presumptions helps translators create versions that more faithfully represent original meanings and yet remain understandable to contemporary readers. Interdisciplinary techniques offer more complete knowledge by combining ideas from several domains. Other fields, such as sociology, psychology, economics, and others, provide insightful analysis of how old writings performed in their natural settings. This more general approach aids in the recovery of meanings lost by simply linguistic or historical study. Recovering original meanings is important for reasons other than only intellectual curiosity. By enabling believers to interact more truly with their holy books, these revelations can inspire modern faith. Knowing the original settings and meanings helps one see the radical and transforming power of biblical teachings, perhaps domesticated over millennia of interpretation. Modern study stresses the need to recognize several layers of meaning in biblical writings. Original viewers of these works sometimes interpreted them on several levels at once: literal, symbolic, and spiritual. Recovering this multifarious method of interpretation will enhance modern knowledge and implementation of biblical ideas. The appeal to review original meanings also requires understanding of how historical and cultural distance shapes interpretation. Readers of today have to accept the similarities as well as the contrasts between ancient and modern perspectives. This consciousness helps prevent both rejection of traditional wisdom and anachronistic interpretations. Recovering original meanings needs both humility and receptivity to fresh discoveries. Scholars and believers have to be ready to question conventional wisdom while still honoring the wisdom held throughout millennia of religious practice. This harmony between critical analysis and polite interaction distinguishes mature biblical study. Recovering original meanings also requires understanding of how books have served historically. Although original settings should always be a first priority, knowing how many societies have used and interpreted these books across time helps one to better appreciate their continuing relevance and flexibility. The technical revolution in biblical studies is offering fresh instruments and approaches for deciphering old writings. Big data analysis and machine learning, among other digital humanities techniques, provide fresh approaches to examine books and find trends that could otherwise go unnoticed. These developments hold much more fantastic future discoveries regarding original meanings. Challenge to contemporary faith. For contemporary Christian communities, the insights regarding biblical translation and interpretation raise profound inquiries. These insights urge Christians to maintain robust spiritual connections while thoughtfully examining long-standing beliefs. This approach necessitates a careful alignment of contemporary religious experiences with historical accuracy. Modern believers face the challenging task of reconciling traditional wisdom with new scholarly perspectives. Beyond mere intellectual interest, this challenge addresses fundamental issues of faith and morality. For many Christians, the understanding that well-known concepts may rely more on translations than on original meanings can initially be unsettling. The psychological effects of these discoveries vary, depending on the faith group. When faced with data that questions conventional wisdom, some people feel severe cognitive dissonance. Understanding the historical evolution of religious ideas helps others expand and enhance their faith. This spectrum of answers necessitates pastoral sensitivity and careful guidance from religious leaders. Religious groups find it particularly challenging to manage these revelations, as they must balance maintaining religious stability with intellectual honesty about historical discoveries. This usually entails considerable thought about how to bring fresh knowledge without compromising the basis of religion. The procedure calls for creating fresh models to grasp religious authority and heavenly inspiration. The difficulty also relates to all levels of religious instruction. Sunday schools, seminaries, and other religious educational establishments have to choose how to include fresh intellectual ideas into their courses. This entails finding age-appropriate approaches to address translating problems while preserving faith development. Teachers have to help pupils see how honest religion may coexist with historical criticism. In this context, pastoral ministry encounters specific challenges. Clergy must provide spiritual care while navigating the balance between traditional interpretations and new insights. This necessitates the development of innovative approaches to preaching and teaching that honor spiritual significance while acknowledging historical intricacies. Additionally, pastors must address the pastoral concerns that arise when established wisdom is questioned. One should closely monitor the impact on personal faith practices. Many times, individual Christians find it difficult to keep significant devotional activities in line with fresh interpretations of known passages. This issue is learning how to interpret scriptures that mix spiritual receptivity with historical consciousness. Personal prayer and meditation techniques could need careful adaptation to fit fresh ideas. Given these revelations, interfaith communication gains greater relevance. Knowing how translation decisions have affected many religious traditions helps one to engage in more meaningful interfaith dialogues. This information can enable many faith groups to honor diverse interpretations while yet acknowledging a shared legacy. It could also offer fresh chances for harmony mutual understanding, and teamwork. One should give considerable thought to the relationship between faith and education. Believers have to create systems for combining religious dedication with intellectual knowledge. This involves understanding how historical critique has the potential to enhance rather than weaken religion. The aim becomes growing mature religion that welcomes both spiritual depth and intellectual integrity. In this setting, questions of religious power acquire fresh relevance. Given new knowledge regarding textual transmission, traditional sources of religious authority could need review. This method entails creating fresh approaches to grasp religious heritage while preserving important continuity with the past. Communities have to weigh several sources of religious authority. The difficulty also extends to liturgical customs and worship practices. Faith groups have to think about how fresh interpretation of ancient scriptures influences worship language and ritual practice. This can entail careful rewriting of conventional liturgy, keeping their spiritual potency. Communities have to weigh meaningful religious expression against historical authenticity. Ethical consequences need careful thought. Many conventional moral lessons depend on specific readings of biblical writings. Understanding translation issues may require altering certain ethical positions while maintaining moral commitment. This technique entails building moral reasoning frameworks, combining modern application with historical knowledge. Another major difficulty arises from its effect on religious identification. Many Christians find significant elements of their identity derived from conventional wisdom. Understanding translation problems calls for finding strategies to preserve significant religious identities while still allowing fresh ideas. This technique entails deliberate examination of how religious identification could change while preserving continuity. The difficulty of preserving harmony inside religious communities gains fresh relevance. Different members might react differently to fresh knowledge about biblical books. Communities must devise strategies to maintain unity while accommodating varying responses to these discoveries. This calls for making room for polite discussion of several interpretations. Issues of divine inspiration demand careful thought. Understanding translation issues compels one to contemplate innovative methods of expressing divine truth through human language. This entails learning more complex ideas of inspiration that recognize human transmission as well as divine source. Communities have to think about how God's truth endures across several languages and readings. The interaction between current knowledge and faith calls for considerable attention. Believers have to find strategies to keep their religious dedication while interacting sincerely with contemporary knowledge. This is seeing how linguistic and historical studies could enhance rather than endanger faith. The objective becomes growing mature faith, embracing both conventional knowledge and fresh ideas. Upon contemplating the ideas presented in this film, I am deeply impressed by the extent to which translations have transformed our understanding of faith. The gradual changes in some biblical ideas remind us that faith is inherited and must be studied in its entirety. Realizing that language, society, and even political motivations could shape what we sometimes consider as permanent facts humbles us. This insight enhances, rather than lessens, the significance of faith. It motivates us to pursue a closer relationship to its intended use. This movie teaches us, most importantly, that faith is dynamic rather than fixed. It changes with humanity. We must go back to really honor it. Knowing how mistranslations have affected fundamental ideas about heaven, virginity, or the picture of God helps one appreciate the need for context in maintaining the integrity of holy books. This study helps us to see the need for humility and curiosity in our spiritual path. Still, knowledge marks only the start. I exhort every one of you to act. Seek questions, explore the past of these books, and hunt for their original significance. Use the tools and current research to find the depth and subtlety lost in translation. Talk in ways that test and broaden your ideas. Share what you discover to strengthen a more real religion, anchored in truth, rather than to sow discord. The path to find truth is based on trust. It does not threaten it. Knowing that answering challenging questions would result in deeper, more profound knowledge of what it means to believe, let's have the guts to face such issues. Truth can change our way of living, as well as our perspective of our beliefs. Allow this to signal the start of the change.
Do you love meaningful Bible stories? Top 7 Bible Stories channel will bring you inspiration and peace every day. Don't forget to like and share your thoughts in the comments section. Your sharing is the motivation for us to bring more stories. Top 7 Bible Stories. Good stories, beautiful meanings.